You're listening to Al Pastor, the show that helps you love God, love your neighbor, and eat more tacos. I'm your host, Pastor Brian. Welcome to the show. Hey, friends, I want to welcome you to another episode today. We're going to be covering Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. And just a few short verses, but boy, oh boy, are they powerful. I've got to just confess and admit I have been struggling with making this podcast because there is so much in here. And so part of me is like, hey, should I dive deep? Because there are books written on this particular topic known as, depending on how you want to phrase it, the Jesus Creed or the mandate of the church, the mission of the church, part of it. So there's a lot that is here. So I'm going to do my best to try to simplify this, and my hope is I don't oversimplify it. So I do have a couple of questions for you. For those of you that are reading in community here at Arvin Assembly, how was your devotion this morning? How did the Lord speak to you? Is there anything that jumped out to you? And I hope that you had sweet communion with him. I hope that you took some time, carved it out, and had one-on-one alone time with him with some worship, some prayer, and the reading of his word. All right, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and read all of the verses. Not that there's many, right? Matthew 22, starting in verse 34. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.'" All right, starting at the very end, that phrase, the law and the prophets, I want to make sure that I point it out to you. We're actually going to see here, I believe this week, what is the law and the prophets? Well, that starts from Genesis, and in our Bibles, it would end in Malachi, but for them, it would be from Genesis all the way to Zechariah. So the Jews have the exact same Old Testament that we do. They just have it in a little bit of a different order, the way that their authorized canon is. And so it is known as the law and the prophets. We call that the Old Testament. They don't call it the Old Testament. They call it the Tanakh. So Jesus is saying, in essence, the entirety of what I just told you, hang all the law and the prophets, these two commands, to love God and to love your neighbor. Now, I want you to think about hanging. There's a commentator by the name of Osborne, and he said essentially these are like door hinges. So I want you to picture your door, and on it you have a door hinge, right? Unless you have some sliding barn doors or something like that. Don't get too technical with me. But imagine the door, and on the door is fastened some door hinges. Now your door opens and closes on those hinges. And so one commentator, he paints the picture that the entirety of the Old Testament is hung or hinged on these two commands. It's a really beautiful mental picture. Now, let's go back up to verse 34. Now, the Pharisees had heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. Don't you love that? Part of me has just a little bit of satisfaction, and yeah, maybe it's a spiritual satisfaction. Part of it's fleshly, like, Jesus, you get those people, right? And he silenced them. So I like that. But I wonder how the Pharisees felt, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees were at odds, but yet they're working together, because in just a few days, they're gonna essentially kill Jesus, and they're gonna petition to have him killed from the Romans. And so they gathered together, and then we see one of them, a lawyer. Would be a lawyer. Now think of it's like, imagine if you had a knock on the door from a lawyer. You're going to be like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, right? This is an expert in the law, an expert in the law. And so he's asking him a question. And then again, notice how Matthew is giving us the motive. What is he doing? He is testing him, and he's saying, Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? Now, we need to know and understand and appreciate in Judaism, in typical, I say typical, Pharisaical Judaism, there are 613 laws that had been categorized both in negative commands and positive commands. And these were all categorized, and people would sit around and they would debate from the least all the way up to the greatest. And so they're trying to test him, but not in a sense of saying, hey, do you know what we know? No, they're testing him in order to trap him. And then Jesus's response. Now, this is probably important that we also acknowledge this. What Jesus said is not something that was new. Okay, what Jesus is actually saying had been spoken before. There was actually a famous rabbi, maybe about 100 years before, that was quoted as saying this. And Jesus isn't copying that rabbi. It's just because he is affirming, and he's saying to love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. How would we define that, by the way? Well, as soon as Jesus says those words, they would have understand this is what is known as the Shema, okay? Now that comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. I don't want to take for granted now, so just bear with me that everybody understands the Shema. But this is a prayer that is prayed every day, even to this day, by faithful Jews. This is how they would get up to pray, and they would pray the Shema. And part of the Shema is that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, this is, in a nutshell, it means you love God with the entirety of your being, with the total person of who you are. And that includes, within the Shema, is the aspect of discipleship, the aspect of pursuing God. Because if you go through and read Deuteronomy chapter 6, he talks about the knowledge of God. He talks about teaching them to your children, about talking about them on the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. So it's talking about God's word. So part of loving God is a devotion to him, a commitment to him, an allegiance to him. Now, when you have this in place, you are going to love other people. And so he says the second is like it. Now he's gonna quote from Leviticus chapter, I think it's 19. I'll double check here in a second. From Leviticus, and he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now here's the issue. Were they able to do this? The answer to this is no, generally speaking. Now that doesn't mean that there wasn't some good folks in there in the first century. Of course, there's always a remnant. Generally speaking, though, a neighbor was defined as someone of the same ethnicity, or ethnicity probably isn't right, but people that were Jews. So Gentiles weren't considered your neighbor. You know, that is what the whole Good Samaritan thing is all about. Like, who is my neighbor? Because, you know, we've got Rabbi Big Bottom over here that wants to define neighbor as those that worship with me in the temple, but not across the lake, that pig farmer over there. That's not my neighbor. That's what I've known, and that's what I've always been taught, and that's what I've always heard. And so really the issue is who is my neighbor? Now, we have also been seeing that they have an inability to see truth, see the beauty of God's word, and see Jesus for who he is. Now, the question that we have to ask is not who I think my neighbor is, right? Like, it's what does God say about my neighbor? And if you go back and you look at Leviticus chapter 19, in fact, let me make sure it was Leviticus 19 before I get in trouble. It is. Praise the Lord. I'm going to read a little bit, okay? Leviticus 19:18. Now, it says, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. Now, God right here definitely says your people, but when you I like to call it zooming out to get the context. When you zoom out and you look at the big picture, I'm going to read you just the whole context of this, okay? I'm going to start in Leviticus 19, verse 9. Just listen, okay? And if you're there studying, you could read along with me and open your word. But Leviticus 19, verse 9. Listen to this. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape from your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger, for I am the Lord your God." Now, here in these two short verses, we have an institution of what is known as the gleanings, part of the welfare system. But notice who God is concerned for the poor and for the stranger. So depending on what translation you use, some would say alien. Yes, I know that's an outdated term. But the stranger would be a foreigner, okay? So you were to have care and concern for the foreigner. Why? Because that's what God has care and concern for those people. Now, I feel weird even saying those people, for your neighbors, okay? Verse number 11, Leviticus 19:11. "You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not cheat your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning." I want to pause there for a second. Now, the wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you until morning. Most of the time, it would be the poor and the stranger that would be working for wages. I want you to imagine with me for a second that you have a nice, big established plot of land. Yes, you've inherited from your father and from his father, and you've settled in the land of Israel, and maybe you've built you just a little nice cottage, and you've got you a nice little farm, and you need some help on that farm. Well, guess what? Who would you have to hire? You'd have to hire the poor, okay, those that would enter into what we would call slavery. Sometimes even, yes, some criminals, but also the stranger. So notice who in verse number 13, okay, according to when you study this out, you shall not cheat who? Your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Okay, not just the people of Israel. Again, okay, verse 14, "You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord." 15, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about the equitable treatment of everyone. No injustice. Okay, so you don't get preferential treatment just because you're poor. And believe it or not, there is a theology out there known as liberation theology. It has totally and completely infiltrated parts of Vanguard University. But liberation theology deals with this topic that God has special preferential treatment to the poor as part of the liberation mindset in theology. But this totally and completely contradicts what God is saying as God is sharing and displaying his heart right here in Leviticus. He's saying, do no injustice in judgment, no partiality for the poor, okay? And don't honor the person of the mighty. You know, I'm reminded of, I don't know anything, so this has all been in the news. Apparently there's some guy that's in, I don't even know his name, some bigwig political guy. I don't know how high up he is, but our district attorney, I think her name is Zimmer, Cindy Zimmer or something like that. Anyways, it's her nephew, and this guy lives in Tehachapi, and he's this NRA gun nut, conservative right-wing guy. I think they found 42 guns in his home, right? Now, I don't know about you, but that's just a little bit overboard. Okay, so if you've got 42 guns in your home and you're not an avid hunter and you're just doing this to thumb your nose at society, you probably have some issues, okay? Just anyways, yes, call me out. You can say I'm passing judgment. Anyway, I don't know the whole story, but anyways, this guy got in trouble. Apparently one of his kids stabbed him. There's accusations of sexual assault, if I'm even allowed to say that online anymore. Who knows? Who knows? I don't know any of the details, but here's the thing. They're going to have to move this to another county because of who his aunt is and the possibility that there would be preferential treatment. So am I saying that our judicial system is perfect? No. Am I saying it's corrupt? Yeah, kind of. It just seems like there's almost no justice today in most cases, but Bakersfield's a little bit different, okay? Kern County at least. Well, who knows? I could probably use a lesson on some of that. But the point that I am trying to make is that there is a tendency, even though God says, this is my will for my people, and even though he says you shall show no partiality, why does he have to say that? Because there is a tendency to do so. Whether it's nepotism, whether it's preferential treatment in the education system, in the workplace, you name it, whatever it is, God is not into that at all. And he says, in righteousness, you shall judge your neighbor. Now, in this case, judging could be good or bad. We're not talking about just judging, like I'm judging you, that kind of a thing. Verse 16, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay, here's the whole point in this. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the question is how was this functioning in first century Israel? Well, according to Jesus, okay, the leaders of the people, the Pharisees, the scribes, the elders, the Sadducees, they worshiped God with their lips, but in their hearts they are far from them. Now, if Jesus defines the greatest command that all the law and the prophets hang on is to love God and to love your neighbor. Now, if you're not loving your neighbor, we have a disconnect from your loving God, okay? Now, were they loving God? No, because in Luke chapter 4, okay, Luke chapter 4, I'm just going to remind you a little bit of what it said. The people, let me go to Luke 4. I'm just kind of going off the cuff here. Luke 4. Jesus walks into Nazareth and he quotes, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and set at liberty those who are oppressed." Now, now the poor, Jesus says, you always have with you, but there was an abundance of poor due to part of it was the occupation of Rome, but part of it was the promotion of the Jewish leaders, of them doing everything for themselves. They're heaping up the wealth, okay? So to preach the gospel to the poor, there was poor, there was brokenhearted, there were captives, there were blind, and they were oppressed. Now, in this society, in the way that it should function as the people of God, should any of that have been occurring within Israel? The answer to that is no, especially not from their own people. Now, you can understand if this was all Rome's fault, but here's where things got really, really interesting. And yeah, I know I'm just kind of going on and on, so just bear with me. You're free, right? Here's the thing. Everybody would blame their problems on Rome. Now, the leaders sure didn't help a whole lot, but in reality, what Jesus is saying is that, hey, you see Herod's temple over there? You see the Sadducees, how well they're dressed? Well, look at the people. Look at the people. They are oppressed. They can barely make it day to day for their daily needs. Okay, we're not talking about our wants and our greeds and none of that kind of stuff. We're talking about just the basic kind of stuff. You and I are really, really blessed here in the United States, especially here in Arvin. I mean, when it comes to like just necessities, there's, we talk about food insecurity, and I know that is a real thing, but hey, let's face it, the area is saturated with food. The amount of food that's given out on a weekly basis, and for those that truly need it, praise the Lord. But again, what am I saying? I'm saying if from Jesus's perspective, have they been treating their neighbors? The answer to that is no, because they narrowly define neighbor as their own people. So this makes their indictment even worse. Okay, are you following me? Okay, so let me go full circle. They have a narrow definition of neighbor. According to Jesus, a neighbor is we would just say humankind, humans, okay? You have skin and bones, you're human, you are my neighbor. They narrowed it down to their own people. Even with that definition, they still were not loving their neighbors as they love themselves. Pretty amazing, isn't it? So even though Jesus wants to expand the way they define it, the way God does, okay, all the way back to Leviticus, how can he even do it? Because they don't love God in the first place. And so a couple of things for us, okay? How do you define neighbor? Hopefully you just define your neighbor as anybody that you come into contact with. And I hope that if you see somebody in some genuine need, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, even yes, let me go ahead and say it, even despite their sexual preference, right? If I saw, which I think is just silliness anyway, some transgendered, person stuck on the side of the road and has a genuine need, guess what God would want me to do? He'd want me to help that person. Would you agree with that? I'm not going to go right past them. Now, yes, I might think that their worldview and possibly their psychology needs an adjustment, but that doesn't mean that they are not my neighbor. And when I love God with all of my being, when I'm following him in obedience and in discipleship, and my face is set towards him, and when I am pursuing him, everything else is going to come into place. Now, I also think that it's interesting. I'm going to go back to Matthew before I kind of wrap this up just a little bit. If I can find it, just bear with me for a second. Matthew, there it is. Matthew 22:34. Jesus is we're going to read the rest of it tomorrow, but Jesus in this small series of discourses, this is basically his final statement to them. You could think of it as his closing arguments. He is going to, oh boy, he's gonna really, really lay it down when he talks to the crowds in judgment. And we're going to be reading that for the rest of the week. And I'm going to do my best to try to walk through that with you. I'm also looking forward to Bible study. But just a couple of closing thoughts. We are to love God with the entirety of our being. I want to encourage you, first thing is go back and reread Deuteronomy chapter 6 and see how God defines that. And if you have time, if you do, great, go and read some of Leviticus chapter 19. Find God's heart on how he defines our neighbors, okay? Those two things. And there's a lot more that we're leaving on the table, but you know what? That's okay sometimes. Hey, if you have any thoughts, any questions, if there's anything that I can help you with, maybe you've got a good question or maybe there's something that stuck out to you, we have several ways that you can do that. We have opportunities at our Bible study every Wednesday night here in Arvin, California, Arvin Assembly of God. Looking forward to that. 2, you can always leave a comment or send me a message privately. And if there's something I can resource you with or assist you with, it would be my absolute pleasure. All right. Well, that does it for today. We'll see you later. Thank you for listening to Al Pastor with Brian Overturf. If you found value in this, please subscribe and get updates most places podcasts are available. We're right here on Anchor FM through Spotify, also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and iHeartRadio. I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Until then, we'll see you later.